Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. Very cool person I get to talk to, Lori Hodges. She's an author. She can talk more about her book. I believe it is called Shaking in the Forest, Finding Light in the Darkness. It's about trauma. She was a paramedic. She's been a firefighter. She's an emergency manager. She's still practicing as an emergency manager, which I always love. I love people who are still in the mix. So it's cool that she's doing lots of amazing things to help out the field. And quite frankly, as an author, we get to learn from her experiences and what she brings out even more than that. So with that, Lori, welcome to the show.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about your background. Did you start off as a paramedic and then go to fire, or what was your path?
Yeah, I started, as an EMT, and the best way to get experience was to become a volunteer firefighter. So I went into firefighting and then got my paramedic from there. I was always a volunteer firefighter. I never was a paid firefighter, but I was a resident. So I lived in the fire station for many years and responded from there up in Summit County, Colorado. And then
Wow.
after about 10 years, I switched over into emergency management. I've been there about 20 years now.
So why did you switch from that service to the fire service to emergency management?
Well, two reasons. One was after a while you get sick of getting beaten up.
Yeah.
And it's really cold up in Summit County, so you get sick of being in the slush and the mud too. But mainly it was because I started working with incident management groups at the time. They weren't called teams then, they were incident management groups, and I really liked the large scale coordination. I liked multi-agency response. I liked the how you really don't have a hierarchy. You really have to have the relationships to work with the people to get everybody to do the right thing. I really enjoyed that. So that's kind of what led me into emergency management.
That's awesome. It's fun for me to hear like how each person kind of found their path. Like, it's always so different, but there's similar threads. Like the best thread is when somebody says, "Hey, I saw something that I really liked it and I wanted to attach myself to it." And so hats off for you for doing that. When you're at that strategic coordination level now, what skill sets have you brought over from fire or paramedic world that you've been able to apply here in the emergency management world?
Well, that's actually why I wrote the book, was I wanted to kind of show what those lessons were from being a medic. So one of the biggest ones was I noticed that the more serious the scene, the further away the medic or the physician was from the patient. And so I'm a people watcher. So as I watched that more and more, and as I kind of saw how they responded to those events, I realized that the only way that they couldn't get tunnel vision was to remove themselves further from the scene to see everything, to get the fuller picture. And I use that all the time now in an emergency operations center. I see when people get too tied into a tactic or too tied into one way of doing things, and they need to really pull themselves back and they need to look at the broad picture. So that was probably the best lesson I learned as a paramedic, was just to take a step back, take a deep breath, and make sure that you're seeing everything before you make those decisions that are going to have the impacts to your community.
I think that's a great way to say it. Like, sometimes we get so much caught up on process that we forget like the purpose of why we're
Yeah,
trying to do things. You know what I mean?
exactly.
And I wonder how much I said this the other day to somebody, I think it was even on the show. If what you do doesn't matter in 6 weeks or a year, does it really matter? Like let's get away from a lot of the fluff. Some people are very attached to that though, because that's part of their identity. If they get away from the process, and emergency management is great when it's about process, to be honest. So how can you tell people who are supposed to be very good at process that they don't need process? How do you balance those two things beyond span of control and, span of incident? Like how do you manage the guidelines of being a great emergency manager?
Well, actually, I am very process driven. We're not very hazards driven, though. So, in our emergency management agency, we don't talk about hazards at all in any of our plans or anything. We really work on the processes of what do we really do? Can we speak to the public? Do we know how to do that? Do we know how to get resources? Do I know how to work with our policy group to figure out what policies we need to make sure the community is covered? And then are we talking to the community and we know what they need? So as long as we have the processes based on that, then everything else is going to fall in line. It doesn't matter what's going on, doesn't matter what the hazard is. We're going to be able to figure it out if we're paying attention to those things.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400P radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400P radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. There's a book. I don't know if it's here. I know the last chapter is crisis mode versus routine mode. It's a fairly large emergency management book. And we kind of lived and died by that on the national strike team, the National IMAT West. We always talked about routine mode versus crisis mode and how most disasters start in that crisis mode and they try to get to routine mode. The question that I kept on having within myself is why? Like, I know where the water's going to go when there's a flood. Like, it's going to go to the lowest point every time. Like, we talk about every disaster is different, and true, the nuances of the disaster could be different, and the people it may impact. But I know where the tornadoes are roughly going to go. I know where the water is going to go. I know what fuel is required for fires to burn, and so I wonder if our data science and our data analytics is not caught up to our process, or vice versa. Really, our processes are caught up to the analytics, because the more that we can create routine mode in chaos, I think the better trained it shows us, the better we can pull out, instead of, oh my gosh, what should I do? I don't know. What do you
Right.
think about that?
Well, I actually think that our focus on what is the hazard and what is it doing has been the problem, when really we need to focus on what's the consequence of that hazard and what is the problem that's going to occur from it. So
I like that a
you can have
lot.
a wildfire in the forest, nobody cares, nobody's there, right?
Mm,
But you have a wildfire that now is in an urban environment, and which way is it going to go? What's the weather going to tell us? What's the terrain going to tell us? So you have all these inputs and these variables that come in, and those are going to teach you what's going to happen, but it's still not totally predictable. You kind of know, like I know I'm going to have wildfires all the time in Colorado, and I know that we have to plan for that, but I also don't know where exactly those fires are going to go and what's the impact going to be. For example, you could have a wildfire that then impacts the water treatment plant, and you only have one water treatment plant for a city of 200,000 people. If you allow that fire to impact that water treatment plant, you now have a much bigger disaster than that fire ever was, because now you have no water for 200,000 people
mm,
on top of trying to deal with this event, right? So
yeah.
I think by us trying to figure out what we do a lot in our world is we try to look forward as much as possible, 2, 3, 4 days, and we try to get ahead of where the incident commander is, to try to really make sure we know where are those consequences going to be, and have we already planned for them, and do we have a role there? And as long as we have that all taken care of, then when they get to that, we've already planned for it. So for example, we just had a wildfire where it was going to impact the fiber line going up to Estes Park. And if
Mm,
it impacted that line, the 911 services to Estes Park would have gone out. And Estes was in the evacuation area. It wasn't yet evacuated, but it was kind of headed towards that direction.
mm,
So that could have been a major deal. But by us kind of planning forward enough, having the utility providers work on it, they were able to get a secondary fiber line to that town. And then when the first fiber line was cut off, we didn't have any disruption at all. We still had 911 service. But without us looking forward enough, that wouldn't have happened. So I think it's not about the hazard. It's about looking at what are the consequences going to be if certain things happen. And if we don't make those actions, then people are going to suffer even more. So hopefully that makes sense to you.
I actually think it makes a lot of sense, and I loved your answer. The only thing I'd push back is, if you want to understand the cascading impacts, you got to figure out the first end of it, and that goes back to that data analytics piece. It is shocking to me when, I'm going to try to phrase this in a way that doesn't cut anybody down. Sometimes I meet seasoned professionals, um, who feel just as green to me as somebody who's learning, because they don't understand cascading impacts.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
agree. Like a hurricane in the middle of the ocean, who cares?
Yeah.
There's a lot of other reasons to care, but essentially who cares, right? Tornadoes are one of the coolest things to see if they're not impacting anybody, right? But that goes back to cascading impacts and understanding infrastructure and what, the wildfire causing the mudslide months later causing, road closures down the major highway. Absolutely. You have to be able to look at that stuff and be able to know about it in real time. It makes me nervous when people are not thinking ahead. And I agree with you. The emergency manager is one of the best roles an emergency manager can do is consequence management and just understand. Sometimes I think people this is the other problem, and you maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think sometimes people just get really excited, like, "Oh, it's the one," "So I gotta move the entire mountain of resources." You're like, "Do you though? Like, what did you really need to do?" And I think that's where some of our stakeholders start to push back because they don't think like that. They think of what can I get away with for the resources that are available instead of changing the entire operation. Do you find that to be true, or where are you at with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say that I think people are too stuck in the response. We have incident managers who are going to manage that response. We have to look at everything that's going to be because of the decisions that they're making in the response. What's going to happen? Are our hospitals going to fill up? Are we going to have additional impacts to our community? And I don't think enough people. I think that they're in the now, and as emergency managers, I shouldn't be in the now. I should be. I obviously have focused on I got to support that incident, but I also have to support the community down the line. So I need to be really far ahead. And that's the thing I see. I think the most of the emergency managers is they're very focused on response and not enough on what's all the stuff that's coming your way that's going to cause major issues.
Oh man, we could go about this all day because I meet so many emergency managers who have to know nothing about response. And I'm like, what are you doing? It's called emergency management. You don't want the emergency to happen. You want to be successful in the emergency and you want to get over the emergency as fast as possible. And the argument that we should pull away completely from response, I also think is a complete disservice. At the same time, everybody wants to do the sexy thing, right? They're not willing to sometimes well, I wouldn't say they're unaware of the hard work that comes beforehand and follows. I just met with a university maybe a year and a half ago, where I met with the police chief, and they didn't have an emergency operations plan. They didn't have anything. They couldn't even spell tabletop exercise, and it made me really nervous. And I was trying to figure out what was happening in this conversation. I'm like, why not? Why not? Why not? And I realized that that person and their team had been in such a state of response for so long. There was a lot of shootings in and around the campus that they just thought they were so good at response that, like, why? Like, we're pros at this. And, I trying to understand that perspective too, instead of just going in and blasting them and saying, "Hey, you moron, maybe you should be doing some stuff beforehand, you won't have the shootings." Um, but man, there everything you're talking about, we could probably do, 15 episodes on. Let's talk about your book a little bit and why you decided to write about trauma and as a responder and all these things. Can you give some background behind that?
Yeah, the book first started as I'm a big journal. I've journaled my entire career, so I look back at a lot of the calls that I ran, and I wanted to write down some of those calls, remember those calls, and then talk about the lessons that I learned from each one. And so that's kind of how the book started. And then so each chapter is a call that I ran as a paramedic and a firefighter, and then the rest of the chapter is the lesson that I learned about life from that. And then that really, as I was going through that, I was also working through a lot of trauma from my own life. And the two kind of melded together because it showed me that most of the lessons that I learned were coping mechanisms on how to deal with the trauma that we face as paramedics, firefighters, or how the family is dealing with a major tragedy of some sort. And now that I'm an emergency manager, every day is somebody's worst day when you're in the response for a disaster. So how do we work with these people, and then also how do we develop the healthy coping mechanisms that help us enjoy the career and stay in the career and not burn out? I was at a conference recently where a bunch of people, a bunch of the speakers were all talking about the burnout that was coming after COVID and how hard our field is. And everything was just so negative. And I love what I do. I love my job. I love emergency management, but I also see the beauty in tragedy. So a big theme within the book is trying to find the beauty in the dark places, and that's why it's finding light in the darkness. Every single call that we run on is somebody's worst day or a bad day at least. But there's also something that is truly beautiful that happens from tragedy and from chaos. So if we can focus more on that stuff, or at least a little bit on that stuff, it helps balance out, the bad, and it allows us to move through the chaos instead of trying to control it so much, and to be able to see that in each one of these events, there's something that we can learn from it, and there's something that where we can grow, and hopefully we develop the coping mechanisms that keep us in the field and keep us healthy.
Hey, we just want to do a quick pause X to thank all of our sponsors with the Readiness Lab Podcast Network, L3 Harris, Forerunner, C. Bernie World, HQE Systems, Ampapar Response Training Center, Impulse, Doberman Emergency Management, and especially all of you who subscribe to the TRL Insider Program and who are listening to this episode right now. Thank you so much for your support. Let's jump back in. I was dealing with some of that recently, and we used the analogy of a rainbow. Rain brings rainbows so long as the sun is shining.
Yeah, good.
And like it's and I think there's a lot to that, right? Like um I wouldn't wish trial on anybody. I wouldn't wish challenges on anybody. But I do believe that this world is designed for challenges. And I also believe that if you look for the light, um, yeah, there's a lot of rainbow and or there's a lot of good that can come out of that. Even wildfires, right? Wildfires are good for forests long term, right?
Yeah.
We're the ones who keep screwing that up. We're the ones who keep screwing a lot of this stuff up. Um, Mass flooding, Louisiana, fantastic to build natural dams around the Mississippi, and we kind of hose that well too, like the marshes down there, and got rid of those, and how that stopped hurricanes. Like there's a lot of yeah, that's a pretty deep topic. It takes a lot of courage to tell first responders and military personnel that you got to find the beauty and the good in chaos. But I do think it needs to be said. I think that the reality is that we're in a forever changing world and things are always difficult. That that difficult can look for different people. I once heard a man, I think is I'm trying to think of the exact phrase. His name is his last name is Nelson. But he said something to the effect of, every time I meet somebody, I assume it's the worst day that they've had. It's my job to make their day better.
That's a great philosophy.
Yeah, and he's, like, known for making people smile, not cheesy or dorky or, anything like that. He's genuinely just a kind person because he thinks he's there to do that, and I believe he's probably hoping that people do that for him too. So, I'm taking away your thunder, but, you're saying lots of points that I agree with. Why did you choose to do that? Why did you come to this realization that you felt like you needed other people to be reminded of that?
Well, I think in our field, we do a very bad job of talking about trauma and normalizing it. And we do an excellent job of helping others, but not of helping ourselves. And I've just seen too many people who either they leave the field completely because they can't handle it anymore, or they burn out for whatever reason. Or I've found people who have, one of my friends committed suicide, um, from depression, and I don't know why, all the reasons why he committed suicide, but he seemed to be the one who was always checking on everybody else as they were working. He was an incident commander, and we all were shocked by it because he was the one who would check in with trainees and everybody on his team, making sure you're taking care of yourself, making sure you're hydrating. And then out of nowhere, his suicide hit the community, and it just reminded me that if we can't talk about what we're going through, and if we can't start to figure out ways in which to cope and try to build up ourselves and become stronger, then we are going to have a lot of people who leave the field or who face, mental illness for a reason that could be something that we could help, or we could at least help them through. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I've had several conversations about like what I call mental first aid recently, especially during the holiday season. It seems particularly difficult. Uh, Speaking of my own experiences, without going into too much detail, trauma is real and you don't know how it's going to come out. And I know that trying to deal with it on your own is a terrible choice. I think there's like a famous commercial of these two elderly gentlemen going to a soccer match. Have you seen this?
I
They
don't
keep
think
going to
so.
soccer match, and one guy's like joyful and cheerful, and shaking his buddy, and they're having a good time, and they're having a good time, and they're having a good time. It's game after game after game. The other guy's just sitting there, and the end of the commercial, it shows the guy that was cheerful who had committed suicide, and the guy who was just sitting there was just sitting there, and he put the other jersey on the other chair and said something like that, like, you check on everybody. I do think it's a coping mechanism to check on everybody else so that you don't have to be so nobody asks you any question, right?
Yeah, or
That
it's so that nobody else feels the way that you might be feeling inside, right?
bingo.
He's trying to
Yeah.
make sure that everybody else is doing okay because he's struggling, but nobody knows that he's struggling because he's outwardly okay. Yeah,
Yeah. I do think there's, some good in that, right? Like, you don't want other people to feel pain, so you wanna help other people, but, it doesn't mean you're immune to it either. So, I mean, you're talking great messages, and I'm a Christian, and it's Christmas season when this episode comes out especially, so, like, I think you're saying all good things that I find, at the core of my being. It's the core of why I do emergency management, right? Like, I always say emergency managers are humanitarians at heart.
oh, absolutely.
And, ultimately, we wanna help people. Again, it's making sure that the reason that we wanna help people is for the right reasons, and if we need help ourselves, it's not weak or anything like that, it's just it's our turn, right? I
Yeah,
mean, can't that
and
be true as
everybody
well?
has something that they're coping with. I mean, and everybody deals with some kind of tragedy. So it's not like we're alone in this. Every single person, we don't know what people are dealing with. And that's why I liked what you talked about with that guy, where the other side of what you said was if you treat everybody, what did you say? If you treat everybody like it's
Like,
their
it's
worst
their
day?
worst day and your job to make it better? Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
because
that
you
was
don't
Russell
know what
Nelson.
they're going through, right? So that part of it could be that your actions can change how the rest of their day goes if they're having that worst day, right? You can totally change it around. So I do think that that's important.
The easiest way to do that, especially for an introvert, I'm an extroverted introvert, I think that shocks people,
I
especially
think a
'cause
lot of emergency managers are extroverted
yeah,
introverts.
yeah, yeah, exactly. We like making people happy, but I like my downtime too.
Yeah.
I think one of the easiest thing to do is just smile at other people, a genuine smile, like, "Hey," like, um, sometimes, uh, sometimes I don't think people understand the impact of a smile can do to somebody else, and, so much so that Japan started putting up, mirrors in train stations to get people to see their own reflection and trying to get them to change. So yeah, you're saying all good things. For the sake of conversation, before I skip it, if somebody wanted to buy your book, where do they go to buy your book?
Or they can go on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, kind of major booksellers, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so
Yeah.
that's the easiest way to find your book, and maybe we can put it in a link. Just for everybody's full disclosure, is listening to this, we didn't get paid to do that or anything. I just think it's cool. Yeah, we always have to say that. It's a disclaimer. It's a weird disclaimer, by the way. Yeah, if I
Well,
say a compliment about somebody, like, "Oh, he got paid to do that." Um, But we'll put it in our links, when we put out the episode, at least on the show notes. Um, Lori, if you could give any advice to emergency managers getting in the field, whether it's people who've dealt with trauma or not, what advice would you give to them?
so when I was a first-time emergency manager in my first job, I really thought that I had to have all the answers. I thought that if I knew enough about the hazards and I knew enough about the problems, I could have the step-by-step approach that I needed, to work through the hazard. And the longer that I was in the field, the more stressed out I got because I realized I'm never gonna have all these answers. And so, then I went to school. I went to the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. I went through their program with both the executive leaders and the masters. I learned about complexity theory and I learned about chaos theory. And chaos theory completely changed how I work as an emergency manager. And the number one thing that I learned is I'm never going to have all the answers. I'm never going to know what's coming. There will always be some level of unpredictability. Yes, certainly we know some of the stuff that's going to happen, but we don't know all of it, right? So that was for me, that was completely freeing to know that I would never know everything. So really what I needed to do was find the right people who know how to who know how to solve problems. Find people in the emergency operations center who can do specific jobs for me. And then also let them know that it's totally okay that we don't have all the answers. We never will have all the answers, but we have the right personality, we have the right traits, and we have the right critical thinking skills to get a bunch of people in the room together to figure out whatever that problem is when it comes up to us. And that was very good for us during COVID because COVID was a problem nobody had faced before. Sure, there are some plans around it, but we learned a lot along the way. And so we got in the room together. We figured things out as we went. But the people in our emergency operations center weren't stressed about it because, like you said, I take a step before I ever walk into an emergency operations center. I stop and I take a deep breath. I make sure I'm smiling. I make sure I'm having a good time when I walk in that room to try to decrease the stress level of everybody in the room. But also, they were used to the unknown. That's what we deal with all the time. In every exercise, we make sure that we throw in the unknown. So they're just kind of used to it, right? So that's what I would say. New emergency managers is you're never going to have all the answers. Don't try to get all the answers, but try to have the right people in the room who can figure things out and give them problems that nobody's solved before. And you'd be amazed what people come up with.
It's so much fun to be able to talk to somebody like you because every time I have somebody on here, again, like you, I get to expand my knowledge set. It's an easy way to stay teachable because, like you're saying, truth right now, and quite frankly, it's a great message and it's an important message. I believe in Murphy's law. Everything breaks, and
Yes.
you can do everything. This is actually a Star Trek quote. You can do everything right and still lose. That is one of my favorite quotes of all time. It gives me a little hope, like, okay, like, what's most important is the ability to lay your head down at your pillow at night and feel like you did your best. And the reverse of that is a scary version, and that can turn into a lot of long nights. But keeping your head up and trying your best and realizing things outside of your control can break. um, I do tell my wife all the time that I'm always right, and she corrects me on that. So I don't know who's right on that. So I don't know. Maybe at least my kids think I'm like always right. But the reality is like everything you're saying is like on point, and it's a message we need to hear. So again, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today. And I do hope that people pick up your book.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your smiles, by the way. That's very nice. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, everybody. If you got something out of this episode, which you should have, make sure you check out our show notes too if you want to pick up Lori's book. I'm telling you, you need to hear it. Embrace chaos theory. Embrace the good that can come from trauma. We all have to deal with it. And if you're going through the ringer right now, please reach out to somebody. Don't just think you can handle it on your own. Even if you can, it's not worth it. Let go of that problem set through a little mental first aid. And if you have a question specifically for Lori, you can reach out to us at contact@thereadinesslab.com, and we will forward that on to her. Otherwise, put your fun comments and tell her why she's great on social media when we post this, and we'll see you for the next one. Peace.